Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, and today we're talking about the hidden conspiracy to assassinate George Washington during the American Revolution. This video is heavily tailored around the book called The First Conspiracy by Brad Meltzer and Joss Mensch. Without further ado, let's jump in. But before I do, I wanted to sincerely thank you all for joining me today. It means a lot. We all know about the American Revolution and some of the major events that led to the United States gaining independence. Well, what if I told you that those events, though notable, were only fragments of the whole picture? A lot of real and shocking events that occurred during these turbulent times have seemingly been swept under the rug of history. Here is a shocking true story about the hidden British plot to assassinate the then General of the Continental Army, George Washington. Our story begins on May 10th, 1775 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the leaders of the colonies that would soon become the United States came together to discuss the fate of their futures and of a particularly overbearing colonial power, Great Britain. Here, the Second Continental Congress met. However, in the eyes of the British, the Continental Congress had absolutely zero legitimacy. Here, the Second Continental Congress met. However, in the eyes of Britain, the Continental Congress had absolutely zero legitimacy, and its members simply coming together constituted as a revolutionary statement in of itself. This delegation was made of representatives of 13 colonies, and the topic of discussion that day was whether or not to go to war against Great Britain. To understand why the colonies were so pissed, we have to go back to a year prior. The British Crown had levied heavy taxes and tariffs on the colonies. This, coupled with the very heavy-handedness of the Crown to brutally shut down these protests, led the colonies to rebel against the British. A year prior, this would have been unthinkable, but things came to a head when on April 19th, 1775, British troops marched on Concord and Lexington to put down a budding militia. Ensuing skirmish to heavy casualties. However, that wasn't the only reason why the colonies had rebellion on their minds. A new idea from Europe that was spread by an Enlightenment philosopher named Thomas Paine preached the idea that people should rule themselves and select their own governments. This may seem ordinary today, but in those days it was an extraordinarily radical idea. Even with the whispers of liberty and rebellion in the air, believe it or not, the Continental Congress was still on the fence with the whole war thing, and decided it would be best to make a Continental Army just in case if things got bad with Britain. In the business, we call this foreshadowing. However, you can't lead an army without a general. Enter the man of the hour himself, George Washington. Washington was a prime pick primarily due to him already having an extensive military career. It is also worthy to note that George Washington essentially pimp-strode his way through the Congress building in his full military uniform, while everybody else was dressed casually. Needless to say, Washington was picked as a choice for the general of the Continental Army. Around 10 days after Washington was put in charge, the army was appointed to march on Boston, where the British placed the city under martial law. However, on his way up, Washington marched through New York, where the main antagonist of our story enters the fray. The then governor of New York, William Tryon. Tryon was a fierce British loyalist, who was born in the aristocratic family in England in 1729. Tryon served in the British Army before moving to America in search of riches. Tryon was initially the governor of North Carolina from 1765 to 1771, where he was very unpopular with the band of rebels and farmers known as the Regulators. Tryon, during his time as governor, had enforced the brutal taxes of the crown had levied against the colonists. This got so bad that many families were starving, and many were forced to give up their small farmlands in order to pay off the spiraling debts forced upon them by Trajan's administration. So, with these brutal taxes forcing many to go into bankruptcy and starvation, what, you may ask, did Governor Trajan do with all the money? Did he build public works? Promote industry? Well, no. He proceeded to build himself a massive palace sprawling over 14 acres and lived in lavish luxury, while the people whose job it was for him to look out for were essentially starving on the streets. Great guy. With this happening, a band of farmers joined forces and became known as the Regulators, as stated prior. The Regulators, being a little pissed off by this, organized a little protest to display their totally unjustified grievances. Trajan's response? To send a bunch of mercenaries to the Regulators' encampment and demand that they end their protests. When the Regulators obviously said no, Trajan ordered the mercenaries to open fire on the farmers and killed many of them in the process. He then rounded up the leaders and sentenced them to death on the charges of treason against the crown. But this was no normal execution. The British weren't known as the Bloody British for no reason. The leaders of the Regulators were hanged, disemboweled, and lastly decapitated in a horrific process known as drawn and quartering. Needless to say, Trajan was a grade A asshole. And as fate would have it, Trajan was appointed as governor of New York, and very soon he would turn his ire towards the new leader of the Continental Army, who was now marching his troops through the city, George Washington. During the months following Washington's appointment as general, he succeeded in ousting the British from Boston and concentrated on growing his ranks. After taking Boston, the Continental Army set up a chokehold on the city and camped on the outskirts of town. Washington could clearly see the British foe. However, what he couldn't see was the enemies lurking among his own ranks. You see, the lines between who fought for or who during the Revolutionary War was not black and white. There are many loyalists living in the colonies and some who side with the revolutionaries in the redcoat ranks. People tended to switch allegiances to whoever seemed most likely to win at that time. Therefore, unlike traditional wars, Washington had to be extra careful of British loyalists blending into the ranks of his troops. This created an air of disloyalty and confusion all over the 13 colonies, of who was really on whose side. In March 1776, Washington drove the British out of Boston. While a win for the colonies, the British would now send all its might to secure New York City. If the British were heading to the city, Washington's army had to as well, as for the first time, Washington and Trajan were on a collision course. At this point, Trajan knew the threat the patriotic forces posed on the Crown's death grip on New York City. And, with the British army being several weeks away, Trajan did what Trajan did best. He cowardly set up an underhanded scheme. Trajan set up a plan to assassinate George Washington. If he succeeded, the death of Washington would destabilize the entire war effort and would jeopardize the revolution. Trajan's plan was to bribe as many members of Washington's army as he could. The plan was for the turncoats among Washington's rank would open fire on their fellow patriots when the British would arrive. Crucial to this plan was the fact that Loyalists had ample access to Washington's men. By March 1776, the Continental Army was already stationed near New York, and troops had easy access to many of the city's taverns, markets, and brothels. Unfortunately for Trajan, he couldn't personally meet these potential turncoats. Why? Because ever since Washington arrived, Trajan was too busy being a massive pussy and hid on a boat in New York Harbor. Since he himself was too cowardly to go out and send his dastardly plan to motion, he had to rely on others to do his dirty work. One man that was instrumental in this conspiracy was a gunsmith by the name Gilbert Forbes. In the dead of night, Forbes made trips from the city to Tryon's dinky ship, where he would pick up the bribe money. Forbes managed to convince over 100 revolutionary troops to switch sides, and most shockingly of all, at least 5 of them were a part of George Washington's Life Guard, an elite group of soldiers charged with protecting the life of George Washington himself. So, with such an elaborate plan, how the hell did it fail? Well, it came tumbling down in a chance encounter in a jail on June 15th, 1776. That day, a man named Isaac Ketchum was imprisoned in the city jail, and on that night, 2 more people joined him. Those people were 2 men who served in the Continental Army and were arrested for counterfeiting. To Ketchum's shock, the men revealed their knowledge of Tryon's plot. More incredibly, they told Ketchum that not only did they know about this plot, but that they were also a part of it. The final blow? They were not merely Continental soldiers. They themselves were both elite lifeguards, George Washington's secret bodyguards. With this newfound knowledge, Ketchum saw this as his literal get-out-of-jail-free card. Writing to the New York Provincial Congress, an institution who sided with the Revolution, Ketchum was allowed to hold a meeting with them, and on June 17th, the representatives were shocked by the lifeguards' betrayal. Soon after Ketchum's proposal, the identities of these traitorous lifeguards were discovered. Their names were Michael Lynch and Thomas Hickey. For some reason, the only one of the pair that were tried for treason was Thomas Hickey. This sentencing had massive repercussions, as for the first time in American history, Hickey was tried for committing treason against the United States of America, not the British Crown. Up to that point, all cases of treason were tried under the British. However, on June 28th, Hickey was hanged for treason in New York City in front of a crowd of 20,000 spectators, which making his execution at that time the most publicly viewed in America. Now, that's all well and good, but whatever happened to Governor Tryon? Well, in 1780, William Tryon would sail back to England, where he lived the rest of his life until January 27th, 1788. From our vantage point in the 21st century, it's easy to look back and think that historical events were seemingly destined to happen, when, in reality, things could have turned out a lot differently. Imagine if Tryon had succeeded in killing George Washington. The fate of the Continental Army, and in that case, the entire American Revolution, could have been entirely different. Thankfully, this never came to pass. And now, you know a bit more about the hidden history of the American Revolution. And with that, I wanted to say, thank you for watching, and have a great day.